Good morning, everybody. The first day of the summer school went well yesterday. So we have 4 more days, exciting days. Today we start with more focus on energy topics. We have Professor Peter Newell with us on Zoom. So he's a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, co-founder and research director of the Rapid Transition Alliance. His recent research focuses on the political economy of low carbon energy transitions. He worked at the University of Sussex, Oxford, Warwick, East Anglia in the UK, and Flaxo in Argentina. He sits at the board of directors of Greenpeace UK, has undertaken advisory work for governments of UK, Sweden, Finland, and also some of the international organizations. His single and co-author books include Climate for Change, Governing Climate Change, Globalization and Environment, Climate Capitalism, Transnational Climate Change Governance, Power Shift, and we could go on probably. So we are really glad to have you here, Professor Newell, and I would like to give you a floor to start with the presentation, Power Shift, the Global Political Economy of Energy Transitions.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Just before I launch in, well, thanks so much for that introduction, and many thanks to Rock and all the colleagues there for inviting me to speak today. Obviously, I very much wish I was with you all in Slovenia, but I'm stuck here in the UK and doing this online. So today I want to talk about this book that you've just mentioned, Power Shift, subtitle The Global Political Economy of Energy Transitions. And really the work behind this book, which came out in 2021, was partly based on a political economy fellowship that I held with the Independent Social Research Foundation back in 2018. But it really draws on a longer sort of trajectory of work on energy transitions over the last 10 to 12 years, and before that, and ongoing on climate politics for about 25 years. So it sort of draws on and picks up on different research projects that I've been involved with over that whole period. Now, in terms of sort of the background and the context of the book, I guess I don't need to spell out too much of this for the audience today. Oh, don't seem to be able to change my slides. Okay. Oh, there we go. But let me just say 1 or 2 things, because clearly there is a big context around the need for, well, there's the emissions gaps, there's the clear need for acceleration and urgency in tackling the climate crisis. Subsequent emissions gap reports have highlighted the fact that we should really have already peaked emissions by 2020. Clearly that hasn't happened, and that the gap has to be closed by 2030. So, the window of opportunity to really tackle climate change seriously and keep warming anywhere near 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees is rapidly closing. And what the emissions gap report has shown, and the IPCC has confirmed this, that if that emissions gap is not closed by 2030, all hope of 1.5 degrees is lost. And it's very plausible that targets around 2 or even 3 degrees are also start to go out of reach. And at the same time, many of these reports have highlighted the fact that 80 to 90% of coal reserves worldwide will need to remain in the ground if climate targets are to be met, 35% of oil, 50% of gas reserves. And yet, as we see in Europe and elsewhere, there's still a major rush for gas. And as other reports, this is from the Stockholm Environment Institute and UNEP, the production gap report, is actually highlighted that things are moving in the opposite direction. In other words, governments around the world are planning up to 120% more fossil fuel production in the coming years than is compatible with a 1.5 trajectory. And the IPCC report, the 1.5 report that came out in 2018, talked in quite revolutionary language almost about the need for transformative systemic change. The IPCC is often criticized for being quite conservative, quite cautious, leading on its more conservative scenarios in many ways. But here, just a few years ago, it was using that language, perhaps more akin to the sort of thing you'd find in the Communist Manifesto, about the need for sweeping transformative systemic change. And what they pointed to was the need for upscaling and acceleration of climate mitigation across all regions and sectors. And they did note, of course, there are transitions going on and underway, embryonic ones at least in many countries, but that limiting climate change, global warming to 1.5 degrees would require much greater scale and pace of change to really key systems, whether it's around energy, land, in urban systems, industrial systems. And so we need, more rapid and deeper transitions. But what they noted was that whilst such transitions have been observed in the past, in relation to specific technologies, we haven't seen that level of change across geographies and economic scales at this pace that's now required. So in many ways, we're in uncharted territory, right? We don't have clear and obvious historical precedents for the scale and depth and nature of the challenge that we're now faced with. And so the central question that I try to address in this book, and which might form part of your discussions today, is, how can we make sense of and engage with politically this pressing question of how to accelerate transitions to a low carbon economy using different strands of what I'll be drawing on here, which is largely from global political economy. Because for me, this implies an analysis of the political work of assembling actors, social forces in favor of accelerating moves towards a lower carbon economy, task perhaps of undoing and challenging and checking and reversing incumbent power organized currently around the fossil fuel complex. So how do we, in other words, disassemble the high carbon economy? And that's a much greater challenge, I think. So theoretically, what I try and do is draw on different strands of work on politics and international political economy, and combine that with work on socio-technical transitions, which often comes out of innovation studies, science and technology studies, concerned with these questions of transition. And I do that to try and make sense of four key elements of the transition: around production, around finance, around governance, and around mobilization. As alluded to before, this draws on different empirical research projects I've undertaken over many, many years now. So it includes work done in South Africa, India, Argentina, UK, Kenya. And so if you look at the book, you'll see there's sort of examples from each of those places popping up. But it's also informed by more applied participant observation as well, and action research, in fact, through involvement in things like the Climate Assembly in my local area, being on the board of Greenpeace, being co-director of an organisation called the Rapid Transition Alliance, which has over 100 civil society members worldwide, and work I'm involved with around a fossil fuel treaty. And just yesterday, actually, I'm pleased to say that London as a city has now endorsed the need for a fossil fuel treaty. So that idea is sort of gaining ground. So some of those reflections about trying to actually move this debate forward in practical political policy spaces also penetrate the book. They're there, and some of my reflections sort of inform the basic argument and analysis. So how to transition to a zero carbon economy in a timely and fair fashion is clearly, fairly undisputably, I think, one of the greatest challenges the world faces. And different people, including these two characters here on this next slide, have spelled out their vision about how to do it. So Bill Gates, in his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, places the emphasis, perhaps unsurprisingly, on technological innovation, getting ideas to market by mobilizing private capital. But in that argument and in that book, he admits coyly, and I quote, "I think more like an engineer than a political scientist, and I don't have a solution to the politics of climate change." And of course, in that regard, he's not alone. The same might be said of Sir Nicholas Stern, who you can see on the right there, who was author of the famous Stern Review back in 2007, 2008, on the economics of climate change. And for him, it was all about climate change being a market failure. So essentially, the solution then becomes pricing carbon and using the levers that exist within the capitalist economy to try and generate change. That said, of course, we have seen far more attention in recent years to work on governance, on politics and power in transition studies. And these, helpfully, in my view, are increasingly focused on questions of disruption or regime destabilization, is the language that's sometimes used, which do form a critical part of this challenge already mentioned of how to undo incumbency and check and reverse that power, as well as questions of energy justice, which are, of course, vital, I think, to any discussion of just transitions. So in this book then, Power Shift, I make the argument that it's power that needs to shift if we're to successfully address this crisis. In other words, contrary to these dominant narratives, it's not for the lack of good technologies or pricing mechanisms that we are facing climate chaos. It's the concentration of power in actors and institutions that benefit from unsustainability and over whom we currently have limited control. So it includes the power over production, finance, technology, institutions, but more deeply and more seriously in a way, it refers to power between and within nations, among social groups, the power of capital over labor and of states over citizens. So I'm trying to, in this book, take the analysis down a few levels to a deeper understanding of the power shifts that I think are vital if we're going to meet this challenge effectively and in a just way. Because I think without shifts in those things, the technologies might change in the way Bill Gates and others are proposing, or the markets might shift and start pricing carbon, as to some extent they already are, as Nick Stern would say. But the roots of the current crisis in an unsustainably organized global political economy will remain untouched. So you could actually get accelerated decarbonisation, but without much attention to social justice or even deeper notions of sustainability. And yet we clearly do need far more attention to questions of justice. And of course, lots of people now writing about energy justice and the just transition across many of these key dimensions, the procedural elements about who's involved, who has a say in what form a transition might take, questions of recognition, which groups are seen as legitimate stakeholders with a voice in all of this, and in turn raising questions of citizenship, but then the distributional elements as well, like who wins and who loses from different transition pathways. And of course, that's affected by the things above, who gets to participate in making those decisions. And then there are the intergenerational questions about how costs and benefits might be passed back and forth between generations. But in thinking about these questions of power over the economy, I think we also need to consider the relationship between fossil fuels and the historical development of capitalism. So Malm obviously talks about this in terms of fossil capital, but right through the Industrial Revolution, Fordism, mass consumerism, globalization, and industrialism more broadly as a project, because the power relation is inherent to that. In other words, what I'm getting at here is to some extent the peculiar political economy of energy, that there's a critical relationship between energy and growth. Matthew Huber describes energy as the lifeblood of the economy. And until now, it's been, and this is an argument I made many years ago with Matt Patterson, I think fossil fuel interests have been able to present their interests as serving those of capital in general. In other words, it's been easier for them to make the argument to state elites that the needs of the economy as a whole are well served and closely aligned with the needs of the fossil fuel interests. And so by to some extent, it gives them a special place at the table and privileged access to power, because the generation of cheap and affordable energy is a prerequisite for so many other areas of the economy and key sectors. And what this means is that even where transitions are underway, as the IPCC noted, it makes it hard to move beyond what I call a plug and play approach, where the emphasis is always on substitutability, just plugging in a different type of energy, whether it's renewable energy or something else, or biofuels, a different technology. So you switch the provision of the service, but you don't think so seriously about reductions in demand or structural changes to production and consumption, let alone relations of power. And this is what I mean by this plug and play approach. And I think we're seeing that with the rollout of electrification and many other dominant solutions to the climate crisis so far. But that broader context, what it means is that all contenders for fossil fuels tend to get judged against the same benchmarks of their ability to maximize growth, trade, convenience, comfort, and especially for richer social groups. And of course, those are quite hard benchmarks and parameters, if you like, for contenders, for niches from renewable energy, etc., to meet. They often don't. It's harder for them to show that they'll achieve the same level of employment, of growth, of trade, comfort, convenience, etc. So it's understandable why this is the case, but it does keep the analysis of this challenge onto a narrower terrain of transition and socio-technical transition, and less so broader transformations. So the four elements of this sort of political economy approach that I tried to develop in the book, one is historical, trying to explore questions of, well, what precedents and parallels are there, given that many of these debates are encouraging us to look back to see if there are other relevant examples. Like, when have things changed in the ways that are now required of us across these different systems and societies? What can we learn from that? Or is everything completely unique at this particular historical conjuncture? But I think it is useful, and I'll try and develop that analysis in each of the chapters by looking at when shifts in finance, institutions, infrastructures have occurred, and what we can learn about that. And there are very live debates, many of you might know, about the temporality of energy transitions, like how fast can they occur? Can they actually be speeded up, or do they inevitably unfold over centuries, at maximum over decades, and therefore the notion that we can suddenly do deep historical accounts is locate contemporary developments within a longer historical process of extraction of cheap energy, to use that language from Rajan Patel. So this is about the prehistories of transitions in Europe and elsewhere are often pre-configured and often contingent upon historical, often colonial, of course, and contemporary patterns of extraction and uneven exchange. So this is partly also then about the reinvestment of profits from those circuits of capital in wealthier parts of the world. So the historical element is crucial. That's the first one. The second one is a more political account, because it asks those questions about transition to what and on whose terms, and it requires a fuller account of the state in all its dimensions and its relationship to capital, as I've alluded to already, because that brings front and center these questions of agency, structure and power in this discussion and this terrain, if you like, about discussion of possible futures. And of course, there's an ideological and political landscape element to all of this, which bears down on these regimes, the particular sites where conversations are taking place, which I think helps to explain that despite the diversity of responses to climate change across the world, there are strong patterns of continuity and commonality in how these processes are unfolding. And of course, that is to do with common ideological reference points. And of course, the role of key international institutions like the World Bank and others, and their preferences for particular patterns of power sector reform or energy sector restructuring, etc. So that's the second element, the political. The third is global, trying to develop a more global and international relations type perspective on transition. So they're not happening in isolation. They happen in relation to one another. They're contingent on one another, because we are talking about the global reorganization potentially of systems of production and finance and so on. And this is where some of the justice elements that I've got on this slide come through, because there is this sense in which costs and opportunities and benefits are unevenly distributed across space and time. And I talk quite a lot, drawing on David Harvey's work on spatial and temporal fixes as sort of useful ways of thinking about how some of these challenges are being met or displaced either onto other social groups within and beyond societies, or into the future in the sort of temporal sense. So there's very much a sort of geographies of transition that we need to be alert to here. So that's the third element. The final one is a more ecological account, and so I draw on ecological political economy to just sort of highlight the fairly basic fact, in a way, that all energy transitions are ultimately ecological, because they do imply resource extraction, throughput, exchange, disposal. And that raises key political ecology questions around access, allocation, justice, etc. So, political ecology, ecological economics, I think, give us some useful reference points for trying to sort of ecologize, if you like, discussions around energy, because they are actively reordering natures, producing new, landscapes, cityscapes, all of those things. And so we need to be much more attentive to those things, and not just looking at, the environmental impact of particular energy transitions in quite an isolated way, but seeing them as related to and embodied within ecosystems. So, how energy transitions unfold has huge impacts for land and water systems, and all other parts of the ecology, and we need to be able to account for that. So why these four elements? Well, partly to address the fact that historical work on transitions, of which there is quite a lot, as I was saying before, these discussions around temporal transition, etc., is often insufficiently attentive to the politics and political economy, because it's often around the history of innovation in a particular region or sector, and tends to also overlook the ecological dimensions of transitions, which I've just argued are really important. And secondly, this work on politics and political economy of transitions, given its more contemporary nature, because it's a neglect in the literature that's partly been addressed over the last 5 or 6 years, often still underplays the more historical dimensions, often still adopts quite a statist frame of reference. There's not so much work on the international relations or the geopolitics of transitions. There's some, but it's still relatively underdeveloped, I think, in the literature, and likewise often quite neglectful of the ecological dimensions. And then the work that is on the environmental impacts and implications of energy transitions is often based in natural sciences. It's around engineering and modeling and technology and innovation. So it's neither particularly historical in orientation often, nor very political in thinking about impacts or consequences or relations of power. So that's why I look at those elements. And of course, they're all interrelated, as I try to show in this diagram. Although the book is divided up this way, of course, they're intimately related to one another. In other words, which forms of production are economically viable, socially acceptable, legally permissible, reflects the risk appetite of finance, levels of social resistance, etc. Likewise, finance, you can see on the top right-hand side there, is also governed to some extent, perhaps not enough, as I'll come back to argue, but it's also exposed and subject to mobilization, protest, blockadia, divestment movement, all those sorts of things. And finance, enables and underpins production. So those two aspects are related. And mobilization, as we're seeing in this country, but I think around the world in terms of closing civic space, is also disciplined and constrained by state power and policing of ecocide in various sites. So what's the argument? Basically, the arguments that I try to develop in the book is that climate change represents, amongst other things, a legitimacy crisis for contemporary global capitalism, though not just global capitalism. I want to frame this more broadly in a way about industrialism, because I think some of the classic sort of left solutions to energy transitions are equally problematic or problematic in different ways. So for me, then, energy transitions sort of are one site of struggle in this broader terrain. And so in intended and direct, as well as unintended and indirect ways, climate change draws attention to and perhaps amplifies a series of tensions and contradictions that inhere in this project of industrialism. And so firstly, I think this is apparent in the inability to maintain levels of required capitalist growth while safeguarding a climate system fit for human existence. So a lot of analysis suggesting that the conventional pursuit of growth, particularly in OECD countries, cannot be squared with halting warming at 2, 3, or even 4 degrees. I think that's becoming increasingly clear, and it's tellingly often that it's only in the wake of financial crises that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, reported for the first time since 1945 that global demand for electricity was expected to fall. Again, it may have fallen slightly during the pandemic, but there's clearly a sort of a relationship between the two. So of course we do get sites of decarbonisation, we do get some delinking of emissions from growth in specific sectors at specific moments, but the Jevons paradox, the fact that resource savings in a growth-oriented economy tend to get reinvested in more consumption and therefore outweigh or undo the overall ecological gains is a sort of rampant tendency. So that's the first part of the argument, is around growth. The second one is around labour, because these contradictions are manifest, of course, in a system in which through wage labour, the welfare of workers gets tied to an irrevocably unsustainable project. And of course, what this does is lock in resistance to more systemic change. So whilst many labouring classes might benefit from increased social justice and environmental sustainability that might come from more ambitious climate action, in the short term, it pits their livelihoods alongside this incumbent fossil fuel complex and against often moves away from it. And that, of course, that's the work of these debates currently around just transition and trying to show that there are green job alternatives and so on. But we do see it a lot in these discussions around just transitions, where the power of labour is often used to try and veto more ambitious action, because the livelihoods of so many workers are still closely tied up with the fate of the fossil fuel industry. And the ironic effect of that, of course, is to slow action and impact, and guarantee and lock in to some extent climate impacts on some of the very poorest groups in society. So the third element of the argument is around global inequality, which is to suggest that these contradictions are further magnified by the need to reverse centuries of extraction and exploitation by elites in the global north in particular, albeit with ample collaboration from elites in the global south. So the expansion of economic activity in the parts of the world afflicted by extreme poverty can be accommodated by cuts in production and consumption in the global north. This clearly isn't happening, but the discussions around global carbon budgets and questions of just transition written into the Paris Agreement imply the need for some sort of global social compact where that would be the case, that developmental needs are clearly expanding and increasing and need to be met, will probably be met using fossil fuels in many parts of the world. And what that requires is a more accelerated reduction in the global north. But what it overlooks is the sort of uneven patterns of development and exchange and that sort of ongoing systematic exploitation of the periphery and the ways in which spatial and temporal fixes, as I was arguing before, are still being used to pass on those costs of adjustment to poorer parts of the world. So, this global politics of uneven exchange is deeply woven into the global politics of energy transitions. And what this means, though, is it's not just about interstate social conflict and the sort of the blame game around responsibility for tackling climate change. I think it brings into sharp relief deeper social conflicts and inequalities about who and what energy is for in particular places and spaces. Okay, so. And then the final part of the argument really is to see off the increasingly evident need for transformation and to deal with some of these sorts of contradictions that I've been outlining because of this relationship between growth and states and corporations. I think these key actors, these incumbents, are engaged in a process that I've described using Gramsci as transformismo, which is accommodating the threat posed by climate change to the legitimacy of the economic system and the political institutions set up around it to try and dilute that challenge and to manage that terrain and to re-legitimate capitalism, as Matt Patton and I argued in that book, Climate Capitalism, through intensified rounds of accumulation. And we can see this in numerous attempts to uphold the plug and play approach that I was talking about before, to offset calls for reduced production and consumption or more sustainable lifestyles, through reference to the need always for more. More technology is what we need, more finance is what we need, better pricing systems, more enforceable property right regimes. That is, the ongoing emphasis. It can't be about restructuring, downsizing, reducing, shifting power. And so that's where we're at, I think. So let me just sort of, in the remaining time, talk you through some of these key aspects. So again, it's production, finance, governance, mobilization. So starting with production, again, given what I was saying before about the need to historicize, bring in political economy and ecological elements, I'll just briefly mention each of those in turn. So the first part of this chapter, of course, is documenting the rise of the fossil fuel economy. Like, how did it come to be that this became the dominant way of organizing energy systems, and from the Industrial Revolution onwards, but through Fordism and globalization, like over time, locking in, sedimenting the role of fossil fuels in all parts of our lives around production and consumption. But amidst that sort of more general background, also the need to pinpoint responsibility a bit more effectively. Many of you are probably aware of the work of Richard Head and co on carbon majors, showing that just how, just 90 companies have caused 2/3 of man-made global warming emissions. And this includes, of course, the likes of Chevron, Exxon, Shell, and BP. And all but 7 of the 90 companies that they looked at were energy companies, including those producing oil, coal and gas. And so, what we've seen though over time, of course, historical shifts in ideas about who produces energy and how through, mercantilism, liberalization, and to some extent, and in some parts of the world now, a return to the state, right? A return to the notion that the state has a key and a proper role in governing energy systems. Although, as Naomi Klein points out in her book on This Changes Everything, it's ironic that at the very moment we're trying to tackle the climate crisis, that state power has been depleted, and that states to some extent have lost control over key infrastructures and systems through processes of privatization. That's a sort of a key challenge. So that's partly the historical part. In the political economy section, in the chapter on production, I'm looking at the global organization of incumbent power, its material, institutional, discursive dimensions, how it's crucial to shifting geopolitics, that from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana, and now the role of rising powers. But also look at the governance of energy production and how dominant patterns are locked in through things like the Energy Charter Treaty that many of you might be familiar with. And we're already seeing provisions within that treaty around investor-state disputes being invoked by companies like RWE in Germany against the Dutch government over their coal transition project, but also Keystone in the US, challenging the US government over losses from its planned pipelines and so on. So attempts to try and accelerate transition are being checked and rolled back using some of these sort of provisions within international trade and investment treaties. And this is sort of a deeply concerning trend. But clearly, many businesses are shifting. We're seeing this uptake now of the dominant discourse around net zero, which is, brings with it many other challenges because to other parts of the world. And you've seen there's some great work by Oxfam recently looking at the assumptions about land acquisition that are baked into some of those proposals by major oil companies. Like the amount of land that would be required to absorb all the planned carbon emissions that they have. So there's a fanciful, forward-looking projection / displacement associated with many net zero projects. And then in the section on ecologies, I'm looking at conventional approaches to thinking about how we analyze energy production, life cycle analysis, and then it shifts towards nexus thinking and so on, as a way of trying to understand the ecologies of production. So when it comes to sort of shifting power over production, I argue that we need to rethink both how we produce energy, how much we produce, because of course we're not seeing a serious conversation yet about big reductions in energy demand and planning and trying to avoid the need to lock in ever higher levels of energy production. But also increasingly supply side policies. This has been a new shift that we're starting to see. We saw it at Glasgow with the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. We've seen it through the Powering Past Coal Coalition. These are sort of small scale embryonic attempts. But there's literally now hundreds of initiatives around the world, some of them city-based, some at national level, where there are bans, there are moratoria, there are restrictions on use of fossil fuel subsidies, attempts to actually regulate how much gets extracted. This is what I mean by supply side policies. And clearly we need way more of that if we're going to get anywhere near some of these ambitious targets. So it does imply, shorter circuits of production and consumption and greater control over the supply and distribution of energy. We're seeing this in discussions around community energy democracy, attempts to sort of take power away from some of the major actors, but of course that's being resisted. And so it does require the sorts of power shifts I was talking about before, a rebalancing of power between state and citizens if you are going to enable municipalities and communities to play a bigger role, but also between state and capital. Governments are going to have to play a far more active role. And if corporations are not, are still wanting to expand frontiers, governments need to step in and put certain reserves off limits quite clearly. So that's production. Finance. Clearly, finance is the lubricant, if you like, of the energy economy and can either work to uphold and sustain this fossil fuel complex, as it's largely doing at the moment, or it can accelerate their demise. And of course, this is the hope. And I draw here, in thinking about the histories of energy finance, on the work of Carlota Perez. So she wrote this great book, which I would recommend, on technological revolutions and finance capital, and shows how restless capital in different historical moments has played a key role in unsettling the dominant order and moving to something else. So once the return for investors starts to get weaker and their returns are diminishing, they get itchy feet and they want to reinvest in something else. The speculation is, are we starting to see a tipping point around the fossil fuel economy, that there's enough investors, whether it's pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, getting jumpy about fossil fuels because of talk of tougher targets, carbon taxes, social license to operate, litigation, all the different pressures we're seeing on fossil fuels, whether they will at some point jump ship in a larger way, and that will be a hugely destabilizing influence for the fossil fuel economy, and could accelerate the transition in the way I've been describing. So big questions, thinking about finance, obviously about which and whose energy transitions will be financed. So one of the key issues here also is to think more seriously about which types of finance capital are we talking about. There are certain types of finance that you want the patient capital, as Mariana Mazzucato would put it, where there's an interest in a longer term investment. The problem with shorter term financial flows is they're obviously there to make a quick buck. They want a high return on a project within a short period of time, and that doesn't lend itself to the sort of longer term planning we're talking about here, let alone questions of just transition and making sure that poorer groups benefit from the transition. But of course, another role of finance in these debates is around commodification and financialization, whether that's around power sector reform that the World Bank and others are pushing, or around the renewed role for carbon trading that we're seeing under the Paris Agreement and beyond, and the net zero pledges that I was just talking about. And so, again, the state comes back center stage here as a potential enabler or multiplier of finance. Governments are seeing this in terms of de-risking, and trying to amplify the impact of private capital in accelerating transitions. But there is a need for what one colleague described as long, loud and legal signals. In other words, longer term timeframes, legal lock-in and protection and guarantees to ensure that investments are rewarded over the long term, and to disincentivize the sort of more short-term volatile types of capital from having a more disruptive role. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, right? Governments are sending very mixed signals, certainly in the UK. I don't know about in Slovenia and elsewhere. But they'll offer tariffs or subsidies for solar, but then within a year or two, they often drop those or take those away. And it's a very uncertain climate that they're creating for investors. And that's clearly a big problem. So, I bring in that historical dimension, but I also look at the governance of energy finance. This is something, again, that I think is very weak at the moment. A lot of private energy finance is largely ungoverned. We do have clearly some oversight over forms of public finance. State development banks in Brazil, China, India playing a hugely important role in all of this. But I do argue that we need to move beyond this sort of fetishization of private capital and this idea of de-risking it, where what I've seen, and I cite examples from some of the work in Kenya, the pressure seems to be on governments to absorb some of the key risks. So around geothermal development in Kenya, for example, a geothermal development corporation was set up, which had to do all the sort of planning, the mapping, the community consultations. It was preparing the ground, absorbing all the risks itself, and make it attractive for private investors to come in at the last minute and sweep up the gains. And this is often what happens, I think, with de-risking. Invites those questions about who's bearing the risk and on whose behalf. But the other key thing, of course, I mentioned here is around challenging this narrative that it's always about more finance, whereas actually it's often really about redirecting current finance. As the IMF reported earlier this year, we're still seeing $11 million per minute spent on fossil fuel subsidies around the world. So, and some of that is for poorer farmers in India. It's kerosene subsidies, which you might think is far more legitimate, but a lot of it's not. A lot of it is big tax breaks for BP and Shell and other oil majors. So there's clearly a challenge of repurposing, steering, redirecting the vast amounts of capital that flow around the global economy towards energy systems that benefit more people and are far more low carbon in orientation. And this is where I think we hit the limits of relying on the current financial system as a vehicle for accelerating transition, because there are a number of these sort of key structural limits. And of course, finance is always, however restless it is in Carlota Perez's terms, it's always looking for something to invest in and to make a return. Whereas potentially we're talking about the need for less energy and reduced economic activity, at least in certain parts of the world. And of course, that's almost a contradiction in terms for many financial actors. So clearly then the power shift we need here is around a different model of financing energy, a massive divestment of finance from incumbent industries, projects and infrastructures, which in turn raises a series of governance challenges, of course. But key sites are around fossil fuel divestment, around fossil fuel subsidy reform. We're seeing a lot of legal strategies now aimed at targeting particular infrastructures and lobbying banks to try and pull the plug on fossil fuel infrastructures. That's going on a lot. But clearly, we do need a far more proactive state, and we need more effective global governance of some of these key blind spots in the global economy, where money is still pouring into fossil fuel infrastructures, which are driving us well beyond 1.5. Okay, so that's the second chapter. The third is governance. Now, of course, energy is and always has been governed by a variety of means and a plurality of actors. What's interesting, I guess, is the nature of those means and their underlying goals and purposes have shifted over time. So we have seen that shift, as I was saying before, towards opening up energy sectors, power sector reform, absence of governance of the energy sector. Those are political choices, and they reflect constellations of power. And so we need to open up the idea that it doesn't have to be that way, that there are alternatives. That there is scope for re-regulation and intervention, and shifting power over energy systems in different directions. So in the historical section in the chapter, I sort of start with that account of energy statecraft and how that has evolved over time. Problematically, though, of course, the project of state building has been very closely aligned with energy and providing energy to citizens. So there's a big thing around citizenship, and you still see that in many parts of the world. At election times, key promises and pledges for re-election are about extending the grid. That's certainly the case in many parts of Africa and Asia. That's one of the key promises. Can I get affordable electricity? Will my community be connected to the grid, etc.? The energy and statecraft are vitally, that's a challenge, I think, going forward in terms of what's the new energy statecraft going to look like in a more decarbonised economy. And of course, we have seen these shifts around the role of the state and market in the energy sector. But we are, of course, seeing in many parts of the world, a reintroduction of the state. States getting slightly more involved, and in some places like South Africa, the state never really took a step back. You always had Eskom being a sort of dominant actor, and even controlling market access for niche renewable energy providers of one sort or another. What we have seen, though, and I thinking at national and global level, is stronger governance for energy investors, so investment protection, things like the Energy Charter Treaty, but also through trade and investment agreements, than governance of energy markets and energy finance. And clearly that needs to be reversed to some extent, or at least rebalanced. So yeah, I then go into to look at some of these struggles over governance at state and international level, bringing in some of the justice dimensions I was talking about the procedural dimensions of who is involved in or who is screened out of key energy policy debates and what that means in terms of distribution. It obviously, for me at least, means challenging the notion of the state as this independent, atomized, rational actor. You still get some of those assumptions coming through in discussions on the governance of energy transitions, as if the state is somehow a neutral site or vehicle and not ridden with social relations. And I think we need to take those things far more seriously and take that into account when we're reimagining what sort of role the state might take, because it is both a promoter and supposedly a regulator of some of the key energy industries, and there are a lot of tensions that emerge from that around the relationship between accumulation and legitimation, as Matt Patterson, my colleague, would put it. And of course, for many developing countries, and here I draw on a lot of projects I've been involved in over a number of years in parts of Africa and Latin America, is the lack of policy space or developmental space that many poorer countries have to chart their own energy transitions, right? They're not open-ended choices about different energy pathways. They're heavily constrained and structured or vetoed by either transnational capital or international organizations who lend them money and actively shape and reshape those energy trajectories. Okay, so then in the ecologies of energy governance, what I look at there is sort of the regime complex, to use that language from IR, of different energy institutions. We're seeing many public-private partnerships, transnational climate change governance, which goes beyond the state, being developed. But energy governance is often still quite weak and fragmented. And that which does exist is far more oriented towards, market enhancing and market enabling than market restricting in any way. So shifting power over governance would require a shift towards more bold and interventionist regulation. In my view, it would need to take far more seriously the sort of supply side policies that I was talking about. But at the same time, there's this drive towards democratization and subsidiarity. And so there's clearly a tension in there. You're wanting a state to be stronger, more interventionist, more autonomous from some of these interests. But at the same time, you're wanting a downward pull of power if you are going to shift that relationship between state and citizens towards more energy, democracy, community energy and the like, and subsidiarity to involve people more directly in decisions which affect their lives, and to disrupt that incumbent hold over energy systems. And just another dynamic I pick up there is the way in which the discourse and the narrative around urgency, which is clearly needed, can play into the hands sometimes of incumbent actors, where they say, you're right, there's only 10 years, we need to speed this up, we need more drastic solutions, and we've got them. The answer is geoengineering, nuclear, fracking, whatever, and we need to override. You get into, if Eric's still listening, it's a sort of post-political moment where you can sort of say we need to suspend politics, democratic deliberation as usual, and impose some of these solutions. And of course, we've seen that in the UK previously around fracking, where local council objections were overridden by the central government on the grounds that invoking the climate crisis as a way of overriding local opposition to technologies which elites had defined as low carbon. And so this is a key discussion going forward. So finally then, on mobilization, of course, incumbent regimes are not just unsettled by restless capital or shifting state priorities, as I've explored so far, but also, of course, by social pressure for purposive, equitable transitions and attempts to deliberately destabilize the fossil fuel complex. And of course, we are seeing growing attention to the role of civil society in energy transitions and research around it, around resistance and blockadia, and questions of social acceptance of technologies, going back to what I was just saying, that there won't be a transition unless it takes these issues of justice far more seriously, and the procedural dimensions in terms of involving affected groups in discussion about their development and adoption and so on. So historicizing it, a look at, well, the role of transformative systemic change is unlikely to happen. You don't get systemic change without social mobilization generally. And so it's going to be, it has to be a key part of the picture. And of course, previous energy transitions are often driven by social pressure and the role of labor movements, health concerns around air pollution and things like that, connected to broader democratic struggles, really, like around nuclear power in Germany, for example. But really from the early struggles for a Factories Act in the UK, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, there's this ongoing dynamic between resistance and the making of energy transitions. And of course, indigenous groups for decades, if not centuries, have been fighting against different forms of extractivism and continue to do so today. And that's a vital part of putting down limits, putting pressure on governments, on investors, shaping their perceptions of risk, all of those things. And what I document in the historical section, though, also is how those strategies have evolved over time. We've seen that shift away from just targeting governments and pressuring them to adopt regulation towards targeting business directly through shareholder activism, boycotts, protests, all those sorts of things, making a really big difference. And then in the sort of political economy section on mobilization, I'd come back again to some of those dilemmas between the notion of urgency and equity and how groups are trying to navigate that, and this sort of broad ecosystem, if you like, of mobilization to try and shift transitions in a more just and accelerated direction. So clearly we're seeing this insider outsider strategies, as you always have, with the resistance, the school strikes, the lobbying, the legal activism, which is really picking up now. Discussions around bringing in groups to debate particular technologies and infrastructure, but also building and culturing alternatives. This is one of the key things. I'm thinking here of, I don't know if anyone's read it, the book by Rob Hopkins called From What Is to What If, where you're trying to sort of disrupt dominant notions about the possibility of change by exploring and actively imagining and visualizing what alternatives might look like. There's a lot of sort of cultural, social, educational work, frankly, to do there in terms of seeing beyond the here and now, and the strong messaging we get through advertising and education, and the broader sort of Gramscian notion of civil society, that where the messaging is strongly about this is the end state of how you can organize an economy and society. So pushing back against some of those sort of dominant narratives and practices is absolutely vital. And so clearly some of this mobilization is making difference. We've seen effective campaigns against the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, around their lending for fossil fuels. We are seeing successes over blockadia and disruptions to pipelines like Excel and so on, and in Dakota in the States, but elsewhere too. And clearly this disruption shapes markets. Matt Patterson had that phrase, resistance makes markets, and it's true in a way, right? It puts down limits, it reshapes. There's attempts to try and legitimate new market interventions through new governance mechanisms, certification schemes, all of these sorts of things, but that derives from this pressure on the social license to operate, which these forms of activism in different ways are generating. But the deeper challenge, I think, is how to sort of contest and push back the boundaries about what count as legitimate forms of wealth creation in the energy sector and in a carbon constrained world. I feel like we're still not getting that conversation at the moment. There's a lot of firefighting, but the sort of building the alternative, the ability to sort of ask those more critical questions is still sometimes lacking. But what I argue in the end in that chapter is how the ways in which these different strategies within this ecosystem of transformation are interacting and reinforcing one another. Of course, occasionally they conflict, they have different theories of change, they're working towards different goals, but also show how in many ways they are complementing one another, as given the different targets that they have around corporations and states, the different degrees of democratic space that they inhabit, that's inevitably the case. So just to conclude, I guess I argue trying to build this sort of what I've called a global political economy account, or that draws on different strands of literature that I've mentioned as I've gone along. I think sometimes political economy analysis is strongest at explaining why things don't happen, why radical change doesn't come about because of the power of states and capital and international institutions in resisting change and accommodating threats in some of the ways I'm describing. So a key challenge for me for critical global political economy is how can we use it also as a resource for finding clues about the possibilities of change, to critically assess the prospects of sort of steering the economy and society in more sustainable directions. In other words, where are the cracks? Where are the vulnerabilities? Where are the weak spots? Who are the active agents of change that we can work with and support through research and activism to try and shift things in a more sustainable direction? And I do think in doing that, we need this more global analysis that I've tried to develop here, so that we can see the ways in which costs and benefits are being passed back and forth within and between societies. So that does suggest the need for sort of, alliances across movements and across different parts of the world. And of course, around many issues, that's already happening. I alluded to the fact I'm involved in this fossil fuel treaty campaign, but that's effectively now brought on board youth campaigners, indigenous groups, labour groups, religious movements of one sort or another. And it's working through municipalities as well as making demands of national governments. And it's a long process and it's a slow one, but I think it's absolutely vital to building the sort of social base that we need to take this forward. So just finally, absolute final wrap-up comments now. Clearly, energy systems are always in flux, they're always being reconfigured. We're always seeing shifts in these different sites that I've talked about, the production, the finance, the governance, the mobilization. They are sort of assemblages, if you prefer that language, of moving parts. And that does mean that there are plentiful opportunities, I think, for disruption and change and movement. But what I've tried to argue here is that we shouldn't lose sight of the power shifts. It's not just about plug and play, shift the technology, price the carbon more effectively, get a new target in place at national level. We do need to attend to these deeper political inequalities and relations, I think, if we're going to bring about a more just transition. And inevitably that means engaging in, although those are big things to say, and I think we're seeing some evidence of them, it doesn't do away with the need for the everyday messy compromise, coalition building, learning by doing that a lot of these actors are already involved with. But ultimately, I think it also requires us to keep in mind a bolder notion of the relationship between energy and society that we would like to see and that we think is possible to construct. And so we're seeing it in some of the moves taking place around the world that I've described here. And that's, I guess, ultimately what gives me hope that we can still address the climate change challenge far more effectively and far more justly. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. There's about 70 people here present in person, so plus the participants on Zoom. Do we have any questions? Yes? No? What about participants on Zoom? Also nothing currently. Okay.
Hello, my name is Sophie Bichel. I'm a PhD student at the Erasmus University at Drift. Thanks for your talk. It was a lot to take in, but I really liked this analysis or this combination of not just looking at politics and finance, but also mobilization and new forces for change. You mentioned that we need this narrative for urgency, but it could also play into the hands of incumbent actors, and we need to somehow override that. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand on this mobilization side of the transition. Where are people constructively sort of bridging this tension, and maybe also, how do we tie in as activists, as researchers, our own sense of a need to accelerate, while at the same time realizing that building these broad coalitions and taking account justice and dreaming up where are we going to go and what does that look like, that it takes time.
Okay, do you want me to take one question at a time, or do you want to take a few questions?
We can go one at a time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Great question. I think sometimes when you're involved in those spaces, it's about asking the critical questions. So my concern a little bit around the just transition, and I've seen there's also a question in the chat there about trade unions. So maybe I can sort of take that at the same time. And let me just give you a sort of concrete example. I was involved in I was participating in a roundtable discussion at the Bonn Intersessional meeting. I think it was back in 2019. It was sort of pre-COVID. And it was all about just transitions, and the focus was largely around coal and around Europe. And there were governments around the table, there were some businesses and trade unions. And they were talking up the language of procedural justice a lot. And I was, initially I was quite impressed with that. It was about leaving no one behind, making sure all stakeholders are consulted, thinking through regional redevelopment plans, all of these sorts of things that are sort of crucial to a just transition. But it became clear as the conversation went on that what they were also doing, particularly perhaps some of the business actors and trade unions, was wanting to delay the coal transition, because it was a way of saying everyone has to agree and sign off on this process before we can accelerate the transition. And yet all of the governments around the table, and notionally some of these businesses and trade unions, had signed up to the Paris Agreement. And given what I was saying at the start of the talk, we already know that large swathes of coal in Europe, at least, will have to stay in the ground. So how far, so I asked that question, how far does the fact that most coal has to stay in the ground. If you were to get anywhere near these ambitious goals, what does that mean for your conversation about the speed of change and the depth of change and so on? And people don't want to answer that sort of question. There's often an emphasis on procedural justice to bring more actors in, and this comes from, you know, I can take it from trade unions, but I find it hard to hear it sometimes from business actors who routinely uproot and relocate their operations around the world without any discussion of justice or the need for compensation and retraining and all the other things that are being talked about in just transition debates. So we need to be, you know, clear, I think, always, and it comes back to this point about acceleration. Who is it that's expected to be doing the transitioning? We need to be very, very clear on this and make sure that the justice elements are attended to. So to give you another example, we did some work last year, and it was on behaviour change, which is not particularly my area, but we're asked to sort of convene this commission on scaling behaviour change to tackle climate change. And of course, again, you get this very generic language around the need to, you know, everyone needs to behave, we're all in this together. But actually, you know, what we ended up arguing, there's a key role of a polluter elite that's driving many of the problems, and they have the most responsibility and the most agency to respond. So that's where the onus has to be. Like, the need for acceleration is on the part of people who are polluting and producing or consuming most, and that has to be so policy and interventions need to target that group. For most of us, I mean, we're part of the polluter elite, as probably most people in this room, but for most citizens, if you like, the challenge is really about enabling infrastructures to allow them to live lower carbon lifestyles, if you like. So it is about insulating homes, and that would help to deal with the fuel poverty crisis and the cost of living crisis that people are facing, affordable lower carbon forms of transport. So the pressure is not on them to act. Those, you know, for most people, is about enabling infrastructures that bring down emissions in drastic ways. So that's the sort of a slower change, if you like, on the part of most people, but it's a faster change on the part of those that are most responsible and have most agency to deal with these things. So that question of speed, I think, needs to be sort of taken down a level to sort of say, you know, certain things can happen very fast. It's not hard to just say, we're going to cut back fossil fuel subsidies in richer parts of the world for these sectors. You're not getting any more tax breaks as of the next fiscal year. That can happen quite quickly, and that would have a huge impact. You know, there are many things that can be done really quite quickly. Other things, of course, they are slower. You have to build the alternatives. Infrastructures are locked in. They take time. So, you know, we need to be clear about that. And I think also just putting certain options off limits. So when elite actors do say, okay, the speed of the crisis means we need accelerated rollout of nuclear or fracking or geoengineering, you know, always being there. And this is a part of your question around the role of researchers. It's our role to ask the critical question, to say there's nothing fast about nuclear power, right? It takes years and years to get approved. It's always over budget. It requires massive amounts of state resources. You still haven't resolved the problems of waste. So presenting that as a fast solution is problematic in numerous ways, particularly when there are so many viable alternatives out there already. And this, for me, this is where the power again comes in. Sometimes the obvious solutions are deliberately bypassed because there's a rush towards, you know, new infrastructure, new round of accumulation. And the more obvious things, like, well, what if we were to retrofit people's houses? What if we were to, you know, make solar panels far more affordable for homes and businesses and so on? Those, because people don't benefit from that in quite the same way, those solutions are often marginalized or overlooked, and it's those sorts of things we need to challenge. So to come back to your question, yeah, there are certain things can happen very, very fast, and we need to push for those things to happen. But that needs to be tied to a sense of agency, as in who needs to move faster, both globally in terms of global north and south, but within society as well, like focusing very much on elites and their control of production, finance, and technology, and how that needs to change. And making sure that justice things are written into that really this is hypothetical. This is what I'd taken a parochial example from the UK. We had this whole discussion about a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies recently. And I and many others were arguing for that to be hypothecated and redistributed directly to the people that are in the front line of the fuel poverty crisis. You know, the people who these companies have ripped off and made their money from. So you'd have use that money for a massive home insulation program, particularly for poorer homes, so that people's energy bills come down and they're less reliant on these companies. So tie those two things explicitly together. You know, a move to accelerate change, but it's a redistributive move at the same time. I think that's one of the key things. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Robin Eckersley.
Hi, Robin.
Lovely to hear your presentation. It was terrific, and I can't wait to get my hands on your book. You mentioned that the geopolitics of energy use is still somewhat underdeveloped. So I'd like to ask you a question about China. As I'm sure you know, China's been the biggest overseas financer of fossil fuel projects in the world for some time now through its Belt and Road Initiative. And it's a little known fact that China's emissions, if you include from land use, are more than the OECD combined. Its aggregate emissions have reached those levels, which are huge. We know that it's planning to stop overseas financing of fossil fuels, so that's a good move.
Yeah.
But did you pry into the political economy of fossil fuels within China? It has promised to peak its emissions no later than 2030, but that really is the elephant in the room, and the most vulnerable are not just at the mercy of the OECD and the US, but also China. So what's your analysis there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to answer it directly, did I look into the political economy of change in China sufficiently? No, because I'm not a China specialist, but I mean, I have done some work in China previously, and I know colleagues like Wei Shen, who works at Sussex, who knows that the sort of domestic context intimately and very well. But clearly, you know, the sorts of the drivers of change that I've been talking about here, many of them don't apply in China. It's not like you're going to get donors having any big sway over the Chinese government. Questions of democratic space to contest energy policy are much smaller, or at least they take very, very different forms. So those are huge challenges. And you're right. I think it's a mixed picture with China. You often hear that China is a huge exporter of solar and wind technologies, and so globally it's having a very positive role. But at the same time, we know domestically there's still rollout of new coal-fired power stations. And I know from my work, because we had a project some years ago on the role of rising powers, and of course that included China, India, Brazil, their investments in sub-Saharan Africa. So we were looking at South Africa, Mozambique, but I've seen similar sort of things in Kenya as well. How are they using their sort of commercial diplomacy or commercial power to support or frustrate energy transitions elsewhere? And what they've tended to do in Africa, for example, and this is sort of State Development Bank of China and others, is go for big infrastructure. So it's true, they are going for winds. There is a big export because there's a glut of solar production, right, in China. And so one of their strategies overseas is to generate demand for that technology. And so there is an interest in solar and wind. You can see that as a positive thing. It's not always seen as positive locally by people in those countries, because often the Chinese laborers will be doing some of this work, so it's not creating the employment opportunities that people were hoping for. They feel like a lot of the profits get sent back to Beijing. They don't get reinvested in local African economies. But also the drive is towards big infrastructure. So it's often, if it is low carbon, it's things like dams, hydroelectric, and those sorts of things that are being invested in. But there are also, there is a scramble for other, including fossil fuel resources. So I think with China externally, it's very much a mixed picture, and domestically, clearly there's still a drive towards fairly conventional breakneck growth, and that is still supported by fossil fuels. So I guess, one response, and of course we're seeing this in the EU, and I know the US has talked about it, is things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, so restrictions on the import of products which are high in carbon. Those sorts of trade measures. But how willing major economies or companies might be to restrict market access for China, I'm not sure, because the repercussions could be quite high, because at the same time they're wanting to often export to China. So the deep the intertwined nature of those relations and the need for reciprocity might inhibit those sorts of more punitive moves against China in terms of exporting some of its products and technologies. So yeah, I think you're right. We need a far more sophisticated account of change and how it might happen. My sense of the bit of work I did do in China, and from what I've seen from other colleagues, is forming alliances with people within key ministries. I mean, SEPA, the State Environmental Protection Agency, is still relatively weak vis-a-vis some of the other actors, but they seek to shore up their power by working with environmental groups and researchers. They have to do it in a slightly covert way sometimes, but there are openings to try and shift that debate. And I think the entry points in China are things like air pollution, because it's chronic in many big cities, as you know, and the health costs associated with more and more people, needing hospital treatment are just through the roof. And it's, I don't know, I saw some estimates saying it shaved 2 or 3% off GDP just because of the health impacts of air pollution. So insofar as that is the case, those might be the drivers. It's a bit like in India as well. When we were doing work there, the drivers aren't really climate change. The shift away from fossil fuels, insofar as it is taking place, of course, there's still a big drive towards coal. But around imported oil, it's precisely that. It's around energy security and reducing the cost of importing and being reliant on oil from other countries. So that's what led to the National Solar Mission in India, drives towards energy efficiency, all those sorts of things. It's often more around energy security. And I suspect if China is to shift, it will be that. It will be a sort of reading of the geopolitical calculus, that it's going to get harder and harder to export things, that actually there's opportunities now in building renewable infrastructures elsewhere, and that the costs, even domestically, of going further down the fossil fuel route get higher and higher. But China is protected from many of the sorts of pressures we've been talking about. They've got their own state development bank, they've got more than enough revenue. So, the World Bank has very little power there. IMF, the donors of one sort or another, civil society. So a lot of the key levers that are often there just don't operate in the same way. So it's a huge challenge.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes. In the meantime, you already said that you answered the question from Matthias on Zoom about the trade unions. Is there?
Yeah, well, I can say more about that. I mean, I think one thing I've noticed from talking to and working with trade unions is that there are huge differences. Some of the bigger, more traditional trade unions, I'm talking perhaps particularly about the UK context, although I looked at this a little bit in South Africa. They obviously, their priority is always jobs and worker welfare in a way, as it should be, but that can sometimes mean they end up actively supporting things like the nuclear industry or fracking and so on, or Heathrow airport expansion. That's been another run-in with environmentalists. But other trade unions that I've worked with in the UK are far more keen on energy democracy, on supporting alternatives around just green jobs. So there are clear divisions, and there are alliances now of more progressive trade unions that take a different view on this. One of the key things, one of the sort of structural challenges, I think, is that trade unions often preserve their power by that tripartite model of bargaining with capital and the state centrally, and they don't want to lose that place at the table. And so they're often reluctant to go for the more democratizing, decentralizing projects that I was alluding to, because they don't really have a say then. Then that's about communities mobilizing private finance often to do their own thing, and there's less of a role for them. They have less of a seat at the table, so that in a way they have a level of comfort with the ways in which deals are struck nationally over some of these things, and where they can try and get a better deal from major energy corporations. So I think the work to do, and Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, many others, Platform, have been doing a lot of studies with energy workers, trying to understand what their concerns are and whether they would be willing to consider jobs outside of the fossil fuel sector. And interestingly, they found that they are. Most people, despite the claims of the companies themselves, most of their employees working on oil rigs, etc., know full well that it's a hazardous and dangerous job, and it's not all that well paid. And so if they were to be given an equivalent job, same or better salary, similar pension, equally good conditions, manufacturing solar panels or wind turbines, they would absolutely jump ship. And that's an important argument. So doing that sort of research and showing and sharing that is quite important for sort of fracturing some of that relationship between workers' livelihoods and businesses that claim to speak on their behalf, to show that actually there is a willingness to shift. It's just about making sure the jobs are decent ones, that there's decent pay and job security. So I think that's an interesting way into that, to sort of show that there is appetite and willingness if the just transition plans are appropriate and the working conditions are better.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture and for the answering to your questions. I had a small comment concerning this huge debate around the real possibilities China can have in reducing its emissions, because I have been following certain kind of consensus towards the fact that China will actually be reducing emissions before 2013. And there are very strong facts on that, especially because you were saying something that is really true. I mean, the air contamination is so huge, or was so huge in China, that they do start having a lot of diseases and a lot of death. So since the year 2014, they have been decreasing emissions almost on a 15% for the year 2020. And I don't know how you feel about this debate, because actually they have done a lot of in terms of carbon emission and carbon efficiency. They have reduced also almost 24% of the use of coal. They have closed a lot of factories that were supposed to be contaminating. I mean, there are huge efforts concerning the fact that actually know that they be very affected by the air contamination, and that there is something that the society also is demanding. I have followed they have started what they call climate semaphores, in which the people, it's supposed to know that if they can go out because the semaphore is in green. And I mean, in terms of information to the population about the real contamination, especially in the big cities. And they are doing a lot of effort. So this is a very interesting debate, because humanity depends on what China can do concerning emissions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There's plenty that is going on. And, this is the benefit of having a very strong centralized state, right? That if the will is there to intervene and do things, it's not held back by having to negotiate with businesses or civil society groups or trade unions in the same way. So if there's a plan and an intention to develop an industrial cluster around solar or whatever, it will happen. I mean, and we saw that also the ability of the state to just shut down large parts of the economy or to change things very drastically during the pandemic. So there's no question that should the Chinese, I agree with you, there are measures being taken already. And there's talk about the ecological civilization and a whole sort of shift and reorientation. My sense from talking to colleagues there is that there are gains being made, but going back to what I was saying before, the overall orientation of the economy domestically and externally is to some extent offsetting some of those gains, just because of the ongoing scale of production and extraction that's going on both domestically and globally. So notwithstanding the gains that you're talking about, I think I've not seen an entire reorientation yet. China is still the largest emitter of greenhouse gases globally, and it remains a key challenge. But I think for me that's what's intriguing about China is the role of the state. It can be an enabler if as it has done, sets ambitious targets on industrial policy, or it can use all the levers of the state in very progressive ways. If all of those things are to happen, that's fantastic. But there's also a darker, more coercive side to state authority, which means as we're seeing, even protests around air pollution from factories often get closed down, and you know, people who speak out about these things get imprisoned and so on. So there's a darker side to state authority, which also exercises a brake on being a sort of more ambitious climate leader, I think. So it's very much a complex and mixed picture. It's not one I understand enough, so I would defer to others who know far more about it. But I think you're right to emphasize there are gains that are being made, and that's really important, and there are lessons that can be learned there. But you know, going back to my answer to Robin's question, I think we need to think in a sort of more nuanced way about what are the intervention points and levers and the discourses and ways of trying to shift Chinese policy, because sort of antagonistic denunciations about emissions profiles and so on are not well received. It's not the way to do it. I think the sort of the quiet diplomacy around collaborations, partnerships, opportunities, those sorts of things is one way of doing it. As I say, reinforcing the voice and the resources and research towards those parts of the state that are more interested in accelerated decarbonisation. I suspect that's the way to go. But you know, people in the central state in China are very aware of the sort of geopolitical landscape and the sort of pressures they're going to face. But at the same time, should you be so disposed, there are ever more opportunities to cash in on fossil fuel economies still, as we're seeing in the light of the Ukraine crisis, right? Every crisis like that opens up potential to move in different directions. You could read it as the need to accelerate the move away from fossil fuels and be less dependent on other countries, but it's also, as the fossil fuel companies are doing, saying this is a moment to accelerate fossil, extraction of gas so that we're less dependent on Russian gas. And China will be viewing. China obviously has a key role in relation to Russia. They can use that power in positive and negative ways, but both of which have huge implications for climate change trajectories.
Thank you. We'll just take the last question from Borut on Zoom. So Borut Tavčar, journalist from Slovenia, has a question. Do you think we can transform energy systems and mobility transport faster than we need, faster than building a nuclear power plant?
Well, transform the energy systems. I mean, nuclear power is one way that people are talking about. So that's not really an either or question. That is one way that people are talking about transforming energy systems. What I'd like to see in terms of transformations in energy systems is a massive emphasis on demand reduction. I mean, this is really the thing. We're just, chasing our tails, trying to think about, okay, where's the next source of supply and energy production going to come from? What's the new technology? What's the new solution? Whereas like massively reducing energy demand in the first place through proper planning so that people have to travel less, insulating homes, all of these sorts of things make far more sense in terms of reducing it. And those things can happen very, very quickly where the will is there. And I mentioned before that I'm part of this thing called the Rapid Transition Alliance. I mean, do have a look at our website. We've got lots of stories of change. What we talk about is, our strapline is evidence-based hope. And we try and showcase stories about the possibility of rapid change in things like transport and housing, water, energy, all these key systems. With reference to examples going on around the world right now, today, but also historical examples to illustrate the possibility of change. And we do that partly as an advocacy tool so that people can say, when someone says like this, our mobility transitions take too long, you can say, well, you know what, in Bogota, they switched they had a whole system of electric buses and pedestrianisation within 2 years, so it can be done. Or you point to many other cities around the world that have done similar sorts of things. So obviously, to reconstruct an entire transport system is a huge thing, but positive choices can be made very, very quickly. In France, the government decided that they were going to put a ban on flights within the country. Or I can't remember what it was. There was a measure where if you could get somewhere by train within the country within 2.5 hours, then the flights would be banned, or there'd be extra taxation and so on. All of these sorts of things. I mean, that's really what it's about. Decisions are being made every single day by governments and corporations around the world that either lock us in to a higher carbon pathway or can take us down a different route. And it's really about pressuring those decisions. So every time a decision is made to open a new airport or to approve a new coal-fired power plant, you're locking in so much more carbon. And so these are quick decisions, you know, that you can just say no sometimes and force the conversation about an alternative. So the notion that certain things can't happen quickly is not correct. So like to overhaul a whole system, of course, takes time, but there's always a combination of things that can be shifted around the finance that's mobilized for those systems, around the people, the users of them, us. We have some agency. People can engage in more sustainable behavior change, lobbying and advocacy around those options. All of those things shift mobility and energy choices all the time. And so we have to be reminded of that and use that power as best we can. So your thing around, mobility and energy systems, I mean, of course, because energy is so intrinsic to everything, those two things are related. Like, how are we going to power our transport system? Of course, that's going to come from energy sources of one sort or another. In Germany, you have solar power, the solar panels on buses and trains and so on. There are ways of shifting the energy system and shifting the transport system simultaneously. But I think drives towards active travel, cycle lanes, pedestrianisation, more affordable electric buses, getting cars out of city centres, schemes at work to disincentivize people to drive to work, reductions on flying, all of these sorts of things become possible. So I think, you know, you want to answer those questions together. Sorry, the dog has just come in, as you can probably see. If you can see a tail wagging behind me, that's my dog just made an entrance. So yeah, I think think of those two things in a more joined up way. Energy and transport is the more effective thing for me, because both have to change. It's not really a question of saying one or the other.
Thank you. Maybe just shortly, the last question from Clemens on Zoom. So regarding China, do you think the pullback of many private investors these days opens doors for organizations like the World Bank or IMF to have greater influence?
I don't think so. I think IMF, World Bank have influence in many parts of the world, but I don't see them wielding a huge amount of power in China. I mean, ultimately, they may be able to, if they lend their weight to particular programs or interventions, they can mobilize private investors, but private investors already have quite strong incentives to invest in China because of the size of the market and the potential that's there. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, there may be China specialists here who think that those institutions do have a big role in China, but there was a time when they did, but I think that train has long since departed. I think they do have influence in many parts of the world, but less. I mean, indirectly, I guess, because the IMF and others are pushing on things like fossil fuel subsidy reform, and of course that has knock-on impacts on China. But in terms of their sort of direct bargaining leverage with the Chinese state, I don't think there's a huge amount. But I'm willing to stand corrected on that if someone's got examples of where that is the case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the answers. Hopefully next time we can have you in person in Ljubljana.
That would be nice.
For now, greetings from Ljubljana from the participants of the Summer School of Political Ecology.
Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.